a bit later than usual today. We're pretty busy at the museum with the craft fair outside. We just had to do some things this morning to be ready for the people that may come into the museum. So I apologize for being late, but I'm excited to be here again today to tell another wonderful story of a woman who I was very drawn to. Her story for me was compelling and kind of personal in a way because of her life and some of the similarities that I've had in my life that made me understand her in a way that was just really enjoyable to read about her life and to think about the things that she accomplished in hers. I want to also remind you that we are looking for your courageous women's stories. When we do these, we need to have some information that we can share. So we need your help in helping us find the stories that will more fully give us an opportunity to give a view of that woman's life. And so please let us know if there's anyone that you would like to share with us. Today, our story is about Mary E., or she went by Mayme Chu, and it's just really a great story. I'm going to flip the camera, and there's a picture of Mary or Mayme. I'm going to call her Mary, just for purposes of today. We have there's a few ways that we can find stories about Mary. She wrote her own memoirs. Some of her children wrote about her, and there's actually a book by one of her daughters called The Chew Bunch in Browns Park. And interestingly, Mary was the mother of 14 children. 12 that were able to make it to adulthood. She had a stillborn daughter and a boy who was killed in a tragic farm accident when he was 12 years old. I have 12 children, and so I can kind of walk this story with her and imagine the things that she went through and how strong she was when she accomplished so many of the things that she did. She was born here in Utah. Trying to get my dates right again. She was born in Springville, Utah in 1863. And raised down in the Sanpete area, Sanpete County area of Utah. She talks about her mother's work, and I thought this was really interesting because she even expresses how she felt as a young girl and realized what her mother had been doing. My mother spun her own yarn, put the yarn into the loom, and wove her cloth. At the time, she took the wool from her black sheep, wove it, and made father a suit of clothes. This seemed quite ingenious to me, for I was too young to realize that most of the other women did the same thing. All their blankets, wool sheets, coverlets, carpets, shawls, and wool dress goods were likewise woven. Also, we knitted stockings, caps, gloves, mittens, and scarves. She helped plant the garden and care for it, milked the cows, and made butter and cheese. She did all the sewing for the family, for there were no ready-made garments, and the cotton cloth was shipped in. She gathered wild currants, blueberries, and dried them for our fruit. We had no coffee or tea, so she would gather peppermint, catnip, and mountain rush, generally called bergamot, and these supplied our desire for a warm drink. For winter, she helped Father provide for drying some goods and curing meats. She filled our mattresses with silk from the milkweed pods. Unfortunately, we had an ample supply of free milkweed. One can appreciate the fact that she was always busy, for mingled with these many duties, she was mothering 15 children, 10 of which grew to maturity, and all of this without the aid of a physician or medicine other than castor oil, olive oil, and essence of peppermint, supplemented with home remedies such as grated rhubarb root. So she goes on to tell about what her life was like until at the age of 17 she married her husband, John Hold Chu. It was not first approved marriage that was approved by her parents because he was not active in the Mormon church, but they did eventually decide to accept him. There were some crazy years in there where they were trying to get her to come home. Eventually, they saw that when she made a decision, she stuck to it, and she was very determined and faithful to John, and he went by Jack, so we'll call him Jack for the rest of this time. So the picture you saw must have been taken on her wedding day, because this is a picture of she and Jack, and she looks like she's wearing the same outfit and with her hair the same that day. They stayed there in the San Pete area for quite a few years. He had the job of herding the community animals, and she would go with him up into the mountains in the summer. It was a busy time for them. They had 6 children, I believe she said. And okay, so the first 10 years they were hectic, for there were born to them 6 children. And they had some lawsuits and problems with the law at the time. And then he partnered with a man in his cattle business, and eventually they decided to come to the Vernal area and went up into Browns Park. The family also lived in many places throughout the Colorado area and into Jensen. They were moving a lot, and many times they were in places where it was very undeveloped. They would live, even with all their children, they would be living in dugouts and surviving on very little. Modern conveniences, obviously not, and even less than most people from their time. They were very industrious and worked hard. The children were taught to work, and they were very good with animals. They were able to garden and work the land. Mainly they worked with animals and herding. They went off onto their own. One of the things that was really important to her was that they would have schooling. So regardless where she lived, if wintertime came and they didn't have a way to school the children, they would move into small little areas in where there was a school, and they would live there for the winter so that they could help their children. And education was really important to her. She moved many times without knowing where she was going to end up. they had their wagons and everything they needed, and she doesn't complain about it. She always worked forward. There was a couple of times in my life when we moved with everything we owned and all our little babies at the time, not knowing where we were going to end up. And I know how that can be exciting and also a time of fear. And she just went forward with everything that she had to do. I just find her so strong, living with as limited things that she had and making her life so rich. We have another picture of her with part of her family. I couldn't find any pictures that had everybody in it. And interestingly, when she first started, her children, there were 6 children in 10 years. Those children were growing up as she was having more of her children. And I found that in my own family. I have like what I consider 3 families. I have the older family, the middle children, and the younger children. And it sounds like in her story, it was much like that. Her children that were older would be working really hard on the ranch, helping her so that she could go and help Jack do things that were away from home. Sometimes she would have to leave home with the children to go to, say, Vernal, or sometimes she even went to San Pete and stayed for the winter so that they could go to school. There were times when the older children were able to help teach the younger children their school lessons as they got more isolated. If any of you have ever been out to Echo Park and gone down into the valley, you will have gone through the final, well, it wasn't even the final, one of the places where she lived. It was totally undeveloped when they got there, other than a dugout. And eventually they were able to have a home, and they thrived. Their children today are still doing well in the ranching and the world, and their grandchildren and probably great-grandchildren. I'm trying to find one of the things is I live out at Brush Creek, and there was a time when they first came out here that they left Vernal and were heading for Browns Park, and they went up over Diamond Mountain, and it took them a day to get from Vernal down to Brush Creek. And they stayed the night there, and I could just imagine them being almost where I live. And then they went halfway up the mountain and had to stay the night, and Jack and one of the older boys was trying to keep the cows herded down in the valley area, and so they weren't with her. There were 2 wagons, and they were trying to get up the very last part of Diamond Mountain, and the road had washed out, or the trail that had been there. And in the morning, we made good time to the top with the cows and calves, and the wagons followed at a snail's pace until they were within about 300 yards of the top. Then the trail quit. The spring runoff had tumbled the lower track and washed a groove so deep that no wagon could follow it and stay on 4 wheels. The lower side of the road was missing for at least 100 feet at the road as the road angled along the mountainside, aiming to hold a negotiable grade. Just another crisis. No time or energy was spent bewailing the situation. I think about that. They didn't worry about bewailing it. They just wanted to solve the problem. The cows were left to graze. The small boys were uploaded. Viva was directed to mind Ralph and keep an eye on Ryle. We older girls rolled rocks into the wash out track. Mother and Ethel, with a shovel and pick from the wagon, began digging a trench on the outer side, throwing the dirt and rocks into the lower track. We all knocked off to eat at noon, and Jean and I took the horses back to the spring to water them. Then we went back to work. By about 4 p.m., we had made the road passable, we thought. All 8 horses were hitched to the first wagon. I stayed behind, lugging a rock to block the wheels when the horses stopped to regain their wind. We made about 50 feet off the repaired road, and then would not get the wagon a foot further. We all dug with a pick and shovel. We shifted rocks. We asked the horses again and again for more effort, to no avail. There seemed to be no way to get that wagon out without uploading it. While we were speculating on just how the entire project could be accomplished, we heard a noise downhill from us, and lo, coming jauntily uphill toward us were Dad and Harry. "Well, missus," Dad said, "I see you got stuck, didn't you?" "Yes, I did," snapped Mother. "No thanks to you either." Dad merely grinned, and he said he'd been a little concerned about the road since it hadn't been too good in the fall when they'd taken the dry cows to Brown's Park. Dad and Harry each loaded a sack of grain on their horses and took it to the top, then returned to the wagon for another. Several trips later, they decided to try to move the wagon with the balance of the load. Each man tied his ratia into the lead bars behind the lead team, and pulling with loops around their saddle horns in conjunction with the 8 horses, the wagon came out on top. Very soon the second wagon was beside it, and the grain reloaded. Dad told us how to get to Diamond Spring Ranch by the night, all downhill, and gave us a map to get from there to Pot Creek. Then he and Harry returned to Island Park to follow in a week or 10 days Wild Mountain with the cattle. So here just shows how she was so strong. She just went forward in a place where I probably would have just sat down on the side of the road and cried. Another thing is, Mother believed in knowledge, first practical and then theoretical. She also taught that whatever one needs to know to live, one must learn. Each human, she deduced, should have practical knowledge of survival, and so it happened that in our house there was never any boys' work or girls' work. Overruling any ideas Dad may have had to the contrary, Mother saw to it that each of their 7 sons learned to cook, wash dishes and clothing, make beds, learn order and sanitation rules, at least as far as she knew them. While the boys learned to make bread and cook meat, each girl had to learn to raise cattle, from looking after the wobbly calves to the branding, butchering, and marketing. Jean and Mark washed the clothes and made the bread. Harry and I built fences. Rain and Viva washed dishes and made beds. Whenever practical, the jobs were rotated. In each task, some of the children were more efficient than others. I was credited with being exceptionally capable with milk cows and calves, lambs and chickens, but no one ever complimented me on my sewing, nor, I must admit, on the management of household chores. I just love to see how one of her children felt about her. I think it would have been amazing if each of my children told a story about me. It would probably all be different because they all have their own points of view. But it humanizes her to me, and I enjoyed it so much. The book is available at the Uinta County Library if anybody wants to read more of the story. This is a picture of she and Jack as they got older. Whoops. I shouldn't have trusted that. There, that will keep it up there. And then later, in front of their cabin, with when they had a reunion with some of their children, one of their anniversary celebrations. As a friend, she was also very capable and helpful woman. Remember, we talked about Evelyn Mantle not long ago. This is what Evelyn told her daughter about Mayme. She said she begged Charlie, Evelyn's husband, to let Evelyn stay with her for a couple of days just after they got married. And she said they could just be together while the men went looking for the wild horse herds. But no sooner had they left the yard when Mrs. Chu told Evelyn, grab your apron. I am going to teach you to cook. For 2 long, hot days, Evelyn was hardly allowed to leave the kitchen. She was taught to kill, clean, cut up properly, and cook a chicken, a fish, and a pig. She learned how to can or salt and dry meat to preserve what wasn't eaten before it spoiled. She learned how to clean seemingly spoiled side pork with vinegar and then cook it into beans that had been soaked overnight. She learned how to season meats and vegetable and gravy. She even learned how to make a variety of dishes from jerky. Mrs. Chu was an expert baker, and she taught Evelyn the basics she would never forget for making baking powder, breads, yeast, and sourdough breads. They made cakes, cookies, and pies. Mrs. Chu stressed and tested Evelyn on the first rule of baking. The more you mull yeast breads and pie crust, the better they are. She taught Evelyn how to make a starter of yeast for homemade bread and to adapt it for dough, for biscuits and pancakes. She gave her a yeasty starter from her own kitchen, warned her to always keep it alive by tending it daily. She told Evelyn which vegetables would keep through the winter and how to store them. She told her what seeds to buy this fall to plant in the spring for the earliest possible garden. She told her what would grow on Blue Mountain, in case that is where they would spend their summer. Never had a friend done more for a friend, and it would be returned 100-fold over the years. She also gave her her first chickens. I love to see the glimpses into her character because she was a wonderful woman. I just wanted to finish with her own thoughts at the end of her life, because it may seem awfully hard to us, but what she says is, now as I write in 1936, and she didn't die until 1950, so she still had quite a bit of life left in her. She said, I have received much from life and much from my family in the past in matters of health and consideration. All of my 12 children have brought me a bountiful supply of happiness, but from the beginning to the finish of child raising. She was very grateful to her oldest daughter because of all the help that she gave to her as she was raising her family. As she went on to say, I just love that she took great joy in her family. And I've been privileged to know a few of the Chus in my life, and they are wonderful people, and I can tell that they received a great deal of goodness from the example of Mary. I hope you enjoyed the story today, and we'll see you next week.